The thermometer outside Jonas Bergman's trading post read 43 degrees below zero on the morning of January 14, 1882, and the Norwegian settler wasn't thinking about Katrine Muller's cabin 3 miles south. He was thinking about his own frozen water bucket and whether the hinges on his door would crack when he opened it. But then Matthias Kessler rode up through snow that squeaked like rusty nails underfoot, his beard a solid mass of ice, and said they needed to check on the widow before she froze to death in that dugout excuse for a homestead she'd been so proud of. Katrine had arrived in Carbon County, Montana Territory 16 months earlier with nothing but a land claim, 2 mules, and a reputation for stubbornness that preceded her by 200 miles. She'd left her husband buried along the Bozeman Trail after dysentery took him in 4 terrible days, and she'd continued on alone because turning back meant losing everything they'd sacrificed for. The men at the land office in Red Lodge had tried to talk her out of filing. A woman alone, they said, wouldn't last one winter. She'd smiled politely, signed her name in clear script, and walked out with a deed to 160 acres of creek bottom and sage-covered bench land that nobody else wanted. The cabin she'd built that first summer became the subject of considerable debate among the 17 families scattered along Bridger Creek. It looked ordinary enough from the outside. Chinked log walls, a sod roof 18 inches thick, 1 window facing south. A door hung plumb despite the warped cottonwood she'd had to work with. Henrik Thorvaldsen, who'd built barns in Minnesota before coming west, examined her work and admitted the joinery was sound. But he'd also peered through that single window and seen how small the interior was, maybe 12 feet by 14, and he'd calculated that a structure that size would take a cord of firewood every 10 days just to keep from freezing. Where would she get that much wood? The nearest timber was 6 miles up the creek, and she had no wagon. No saw bigger than a bucksaw. No help. "You'll freeze before Christmas," Thorvaldsen had told her bluntly. He wasn't trying to be cruel. He'd seen 2 families give up their claims the previous winter after losing children to cold and pneumonia. "That cabin's too small to hold heat proper, and you haven't got near enough firewood laid by." Katrine had nodded as if considering his words carefully. Then she'd said, "I appreciate your concern," and gone back to digging. That's what puzzled everyone most. The digging. Through July and August, while she should have been putting up hay or hunting meat or cutting every stick of firewood she could find, Katrine spent hours each day with a shovel and pickaxe, excavating what looked like a root cellar beside her cabin. She'd haul bucket after bucket of earth up from the hole, pile it carefully nearby, then climb back down and dig some more. The work went slowly because the ground was hard-packed clay 2 feet down, and she'd hit rocks that needed prying loose. But she kept at it with the same quiet determination she brought to everything else. Sarah Kessler, Matthias's wife, brought over a basket of bread one afternoon and found Katrine covered in dirt, her hands wrapped in rags because she'd worn through her gloves. The hole was 8 feet deep, maybe 10 feet square, and Katrine was lining the walls with flat stones she'd gathered from the creek. "What are you building?" Sarah asked, though she already thought she knew. Every homestead needed a root cellar for storing vegetables through winter. "A warm room," Katrine said. Sarah frowned. "Underground? That'll be cold as a grave come December." "We'll see." Katrine accepted the bread with genuine gratitude, broke off a piece, and ate it standing in her hole. She didn't elaborate, and Sarah didn't press. You learned not to pry too much in frontier country. People had their reasons for things, and privacy mattered when your nearest neighbor was 2 miles away. By September, Katrine had finished her excavation and built something nobody quite understood. She'd framed out a small room down there with lodgepole pine logs, maybe 6 feet by 8 feet, tall enough to stand in if you didn't mind brushing the ceiling. She'd lined the floor with more flat stones set in clay, then covered the whole structure with the dirt she'd removed, piling it up and tamping it down until there was a dome-shaped mound next to her cabin, 8 feet high in the center, sloping down to ground level. A narrow tunnel connected the underground room to her cabin through a small door she'd cut in the floor, and she'd built a wooden hatch over it with leather hinges. The whole arrangement struck people as odd. If you wanted a root cellar, you didn't connect it directly to your living space that let cold air in. And if you were building some kind of storm shelter, you put the entrance outside where you could get to it even if your cabin collapsed. Katrine's design made no practical sense to folks who'd been homesteading for years. "She's confused about how cold works," said Michael Brennan, an Irishman who'd survived 3 Montana winters already. "Heat rises, cold sinks. That hole's going to be an icebox, and she's got it connected right to her floor. She might as well leave her door open all winter." But Katrine wasn't asking for advice, and she wasn't complaining. She worked her claim alone, cut enough wood to fill a shed she'd built against the cabin's north wall, hunted elk and antelope, dried the meat properly, harvested wild turnips and prairie onions, hauled water from the creek in barrels, and generally did everything a person needed to do to survive a Montana winter. She also spent time doing something nobody could quite figure out. She'd gather large rocks from the creek, heat them in her cook fire until they were almost too hot to handle, then carry them down into her underground room and arrange them carefully along the walls. She did this every few days throughout October and November, heating rocks and taking them below. If you want to understand what happened that January when the temperature hit 43 below, you need to know something about how the Earth holds heat. I'm going to take just a minute here to ask you to hit that like button, because this story gets into some traditional wisdom that most people have completely forgotten. And the only way we keep this kind of knowledge alive is by sharing it with others who value the old ways. Your support helps preserve these frontier techniques that saved lives. The Earth 6 feet down maintains a relatively constant temperature year-round, usually between 45 and 55 degrees Fahrenheit, depending on latitude. Ancient peoples knew this. That's why dugouts and earth-sheltered homes showed up in cultures from Ireland to North Africa to the Great Plains. The Lakota built earth lodges that stayed warm in winter and cool in summer using this principle. Settlers from Eastern Europe brought similar knowledge, having seen earth-burned cellars that never froze. But most American homesteaders in the 1880s had forgotten or never learned these techniques. They built thin-walled cabins that leaked heat like sieves and burned enormous amounts of firewood trying to stay alive. Katrine Müller had grown up in Bavaria, in a village where root cellars were dug deep and houses were built partially underground to save on heating. She'd learned from her grandfather, who'd learned from his grandfather, that Earth is both insulator and thermal battery. 6 feet of soil provides about R30 insulation, roughly equivalent to 18 inches of modern fiberglass. More importantly, packed earth stores heat. When you warm a room surrounded by 8 feet of earth, that earth absorbs the heat slowly and releases it slowly, moderating temperature swings. What Katrine had built wasn't just a root cellar. It was a thermal mass heating system designed for survival. She'd spent those weeks in October and November charging her system. Every time she heated rocks and carried them into her underground room, she was depositing thermal energy into the earth surrounding that space. The rocks themselves would cool in a few hours, but they'd transfer their heat to the clay and stone walls, which would hold it for days or weeks. She was essentially preheating thousands of pounds of earth before winter arrived. Once that earth mass reached a stable warm temperature, it would act like a giant battery, releasing heat slowly and steadily even when the surface temperature dropped to deadly lows. The tunnel connecting her underground room to the cabin served a specific purpose. Warm air from below would rise naturally into the cabin through convection, while cooler air from the cabin would sink down through the tunnel. This created a gentle circulation that heated her living space without requiring a conventional fireplace or stove in the cabin itself. She did have a small sheet metal stove for cooking and backup heat, but she burned maybe a tenth of the wood her neighbors used. Her cabin was small by design. Less volume meant less air to heat. The thick sod roof provided excellent insulation, better than wooden shingles. The single south-facing window caught winter sun during the day. And beneath it all, that underground room radiated stored heat upward through the floor. By December, when neighbors stopped by to check on her, they found her cabin comfortably warm, even though her wood pile didn't seem to be shrinking much. She'd smile and offer coffee and never quite explain her system. People assumed she was just tough, that she tolerated cold better than most, or that maybe her cabin was smaller and therefore easier to heat. Nobody thought to ask about the underground room because nobody understood what it actually was. Then came the cold snap of January 1882. Weather on the northern plains can turn deadly with shocking speed. A week of mild weather, temperatures in the 20s, almost pleasant for January, gave way overnight to Arctic air that swept down from Canada like a physical force. The temperature dropped 60 degrees in 18 hours. On the morning of the 14th, Jonas Bergman's thermometer read -43, and it was still falling. This was killing cold. Exposed skin froze in under 2 minutes. Breath crystallized instantly into clouds of ice particles. Metal became brittle and dangerous to touch. Livestock caught outside died where they stood. Even inside poorly insulated cabins, water froze in buckets 6 feet from the stove. Families burned furniture when their firewood ran out. Children slept under every blanket and coat the household owned and still woke with frost on their eyelashes. Matthias Kessler had lost his temper with his wife the night before when she'd suggested someone should check on Katrine Müller. She made her choice, he'd snapped, frustrated by his own fear and the cold that leaked through every crack in their cabin despite the stove roaring at full heat. Woman's too stubborn to ask for help. That's her affair. But by morning, with the thermometer showing -43 and still dropping, his conscience bothered him. Katrine lived alone. If something had happened, if her stove had gone out, if she'd run out of wood, if she'd gotten injured, she'd be dead by now. They'd find her body frozen solid, probably curled up under blankets, another victim of frontier pride. So Matthias saddled his horse, wrapped his face in wool scarves until only his eyes showed, and rode toward Jonas Bergman's place to collect someone else for the grim task. You didn't visit a deceased person's home alone if you could help it. The sight stayed with you. Henrik Thorvaldsen joined them, wrapping himself in buffalo hide and muttering prayers in Norwegian. The 3 men rode south along Bridger Creek, not talking much because conversation required exposing your mouth to air that burned like fire. The world had gone silent under the cold. No birds, no wind, just the squeak of snow and the labored breathing of horses that didn't want to be out in this. Katrine's cabin sat on a bench above the creek, cottonwoods bare around it, smoke rising from... Smoke was rising from her stovepipe. Thin smoke, just a wisp, but smoke nonetheless. She's still alive, Jonas said, surprise evident in his voice. They dismounted and approached the cabin. Matthias knocked hard on the door, expecting the worst. Maybe she'd died after her fire went out. Maybe the smoke was just embers burning down. The door opened. Katrine stood there in a simple wool dress, no shawl, her face calm and showing no signs of distress. Warm air rolled out from behind her, and through the open door they could see her cabin was comfortable. Not just survivable, comfortable. The men stood there breathing frost clouds, wrapped in every layer they owned, faces numb despite the scarves, and this woman looked like she was having a normal January day. "Gentlemen," she said, "come in before you freeze." They stumbled inside, too shocked to be polite. The cabin was genuinely warm. Not the desperate warmth of an overstoked stove barely holding back the cold, but steady, even warmth that felt stable. They could see the small sheet metal stove in the corner, and it held only a few pieces of wood burning lazily. That stove couldn't possibly heat this space to this temperature in this cold. Henrik peeled off his buffalo robe and stared around the cabin, trying to understand what he was experiencing. "How?" he managed. Katrine smiled. "Would you like coffee? I just made a pot." While she poured, Matthias noticed the wooden hatch in the floor standing open. Warm air was definitely rising from that opening. He walked over and looked down into darkness, then back at Katrine. "May I?" he asked, gesturing at the hatch. "Of course." He climbed down the short ladder into the tunnel, and his eyes adjusted to light coming through from the cabin above. The tunnel led to a small room, the underground room everyone had dismissed as a poorly designed root cellar. He stepped into it and stopped. The room was warmer than the cabin, noticeably warmer. The walls, lined with stone and earth, radiated gentle heat like a living thing. He put his hand against the clay wall and felt warmth soaking into his frozen fingers. The air was dry and still, and felt like early autumn instead of deadly winter. "Henrik, Jonas, get down here." The three men crowded into the small underground room, stunned into silence. The temperature down here had to be at least 60 degrees, maybe 65, comfortable enough to sit in shirt sleeves. And there was no stove, no fire, no obvious heat source at all. Just earth and stone radiating stored warmth. How is this possible? Henrik whispered. Katrine had followed them down. Earth holds heat, she said simply. I spent 2 months warming the ground around this room. Once the earth gets warm, it stays warm. The cold can't reach down here fast enough to matter. The room heats the tunnel heats the cabin floor, and the warm air rises. I use the stove for cooking and to add a little extra heat when needed, but mostly the earth does the work. Jonas did calculations in his head. How much firewood are you burning? Half a cord since November. The men looked at each other. Half a cord in 2.5 months. They were each burning that much every 10 days. Matthias ran his hand along the stone wall again. The warmth was unmistakable, real, steady. Did you learn this in Bavaria? My grandfather's village had houses built into hillsides. They stayed warm all winter with very little wood. I just applied the same principle here. Henrik's face showed a complicated mix of emotions: embarrassment, respect, wonder, and the peculiar frustration of someone realizing he'd missed something obvious. We thought you were being foolish, he admitted. Building this underground, connecting it to your cabin. We thought you didn't understand how cold works. Cold sinks, Katrine agreed, but warmth rises, and earth remembers heat better than wood or stone or air. You just have to give it time to learn. They climbed back up to the cabin, and Katrine poured coffee while the men processed what they'd experienced. Outside, the temperature had dropped to -46 degrees. Inside Katrine's cabin, warmed by earth that had stored heat from rocks heated in October and November, the temperature held steady around 68 degrees. The small stove flickered with a fire that barely qualified as such. How many people know about this? Matthias asked. Katrine shrugged. In the old country, it's common knowledge. Here, I haven't seen anyone build this way. Most people seem to think you fight cold with fire, burning more and more wood. But you can't burn enough to win that fight. The cold is bigger than any fire. Better to work with the earth. Jonas was already planning. Could this be built under an existing cabin? Could a family dig down and add a room like this? If the ground isn't frozen yet. It's hard work, but yes, the digging is the hardest part. Everything else is just patient construction. Henrik pulled out a small notebook he carried for tracking livestock records. Would you mind if I sketched this? The room dimensions, the tunnel, how it connects to the cabin. I'd be happy to show you properly, Katrine said, when the weather breaks. The weather didn't break for 4 more days. The temperature stayed below -40 throughout, reaching -49 on the night of January 16th. 3 families along Bridger Creek ran completely out of firewood. 2 others burned through their emergency supplies and had to butcher livestock for fat to burn. One family's cabin caught fire when they overstoked their stove in desperation, and they lost everything they owned except the clothes they wore while fleeing into deadly cold. They survived by reaching the Bergman place, but the father lost 3 toes and 2 fingers to frostbite. Katrine used 4 pieces of firewood per day. When the cold finally broke on January 19th, with temperatures surging back to a balmy 15 above zero, every family within 10 miles knew about the widow Muller's warm room underground. Henrik Torvaldsen arrived with his oldest son and a notebook full of questions. Michael Brennan came with his wife, bringing fresh bread and a request to see the underground room for himself. Sarah Kessler organized 6 women to visit together, ostensibly for a quilting circle, but really to understand how Katrine had survived so comfortably. Katrine welcomed them all. She showed them the underground room's dimensions, 8 feet by 6 feet by 6.5 feet tall. She explained how she'd lined the walls with stone to increase thermal mass. She demonstrated how the heated rocks had transferred warmth to the surrounding earth. She walked them through the tunnel design and explained the convection cycle that moved warm air upward. The key is starting in summer, she told a group of 5 men who'd ridden over together. You need months to charge the system. Heat rocks whenever you cook, carry them down, let them warm the earth. By the time winter comes, you've stored enough heat to last till spring. The Earth gives it back slowly. What about ventilation? Asked Thomas Riley, a former Army engineer who'd homesteaded after his service ended. Don't you risk suffocation in a sealed underground room? The tunnel provides air exchange, and the room isn't perfectly sealed. There's slow air movement through the earth itself. I've never felt short of breath. Moisture. The stone floor drains to gravel underneath. The earth walls breathe. I keep a small clay pot of salt down there to monitor humidity, and it stays dry. Thomas made notes. This is based on ancient techniques. Old as civilization. People built underground in Persia, in China, in Ireland, in my homeland. Anywhere people needed to stay warm without unlimited fuel. We didn't invent anything new. We just forgot what worked. Over the next month, 7 families began excavation projects. Henrik Thorvaldsen dug out a space under his existing cabin, breaking through the floor and excavating carefully so the cabin wouldn't collapse. Michael Brennan started fresh construction, building a new cabin with an underground room planned from the beginning. The Riley family, with Thomas's engineering background, designed an elaborate system with 2 underground rooms and a tunnel that ran 30 feet to an excavation in a hillside, creating natural temperature regulation. Not all the projects succeeded. The Johansons hit bedrock 4 feet down and couldn't excavate deeper. The Carlsons built their underground room too shallow, only 5 feet of earth cover, and it didn't hold heat well enough. The Fitzgerald family built everything correctly but didn't understand the need to preheat the earth, and they spent their first winter in a cold underground room wondering what they'd done wrong. But the families who followed Katrine's methods found the same results she had. The Thorvaldsen family burned 60% less firewood than the previous winter. The Brennans, in their new cabin, stayed comfortable through February's cold using less than 3 cords for the entire winter. Thomas Riley's elaborate system worked so well he started writing a technical paper documenting the construction methods, hoping to submit it to an engineering journal in Chicago. Here's what you need to understand about frontier life in the 1880s. Survival wasn't about being tough or brave or stubborn, though those qualities helped. Survival was about knowledge. The families who thrived were the ones who understood their environment and worked with it instead of against it. European immigrants who brought knowledge of earth-sheltered building had huge advantages over American settlers who'd only known wood-frame construction. Native peoples who'd lived on the plains for generations knew techniques that newcomers died for lack of knowing. Katrine Miller's warm room became frontier legend pretty quickly. Word spread along the freight routes and through the mining camps. People started calling it the Bavarian method, though similar techniques existed in dozens of cultures. Land office agents in Red Lodge began mentioning it to new homesteaders. A few entrepreneurial types tried to sell plans for underground heating rooms, though Katrine never charged anyone for information. The real impact showed up in mortality statistics. Carbon County recorded 14 deaths attributed to exposure or freezing in the winter of 1880-81. In the winter of 1882-83, after multiple families had adopted earth-sheltered heating, that number dropped to 4. By 1885, it was down to 1, and that was a prospector who died alone in the mountains, nowhere near any settlement. The technique spread beyond Montana. Homesteaders in Wyoming Territory built similar systems. Settlers in Dakota Territory adapted the design for their conditions. Immigrant communities throughout the northern plains exchanged information about underground heating rooms, comparing notes on construction methods and thermal performance. If you're finding value in this story of forgotten survival wisdom, I want to encourage you to subscribe to this channel. We're working to document traditional techniques that saved lives on the frontier. Knowledge that's being lost as fewer people remember how our ancestors survived impossible conditions. By subscribing, you're helping preserve this important part of American history for future generations who might need to rediscover these skills. Modern analysis of Katrine's system shows she understood principles that engineers wouldn't formally document for another 50 years. Her underground room functioned as a ground source heat storage system, using the Earth's stable temperature and thermal mass to moderate indoor climate. The specific heat capacity of soil, approximately 0.2 BTU per pound per degree Fahrenheit, meant that the 8 feet of earth surrounding her room stored roughly 20,000 BTU per degree of temperature increase. By raising that Earth mass from its natural 48 degrees to 65 degrees through her preheating process, she stored about 340,000 BTU of thermal energy. For comparison, burning 1 pound of seasoned hardwood releases roughly 7,500 BTU. Her stored Earth mass held the equivalent of 45 pounds of firewood worth of heat, and it released that heat continuously over months instead of hours. The system was remarkably efficient. What happened to Katrine Muller? That's the part of the story that usually gets left out. She proved up her claim in 1883, earning full title to her 160 acres after the required 5 years of continuous residence and improvement. She expanded her cabin, adding a second room above ground and a second underground room for food storage separate from her heating room. She raised sheep, selling wool to the mining camps. She helped 17 other families build earth-sheltered heating systems, traveling to their homesteads to advise on excavation and construction. She taught 3 different women to read, holding informal classes in her cabin during winter months when outdoor work was impossible. In 1886, she married Henrik Torvaldsen. He was a widower by then, his first wife having died in childbirth the previous year. They combined their homesteads into a larger operation and built a house incorporating both above-ground living space and an extensive underground room system. That house still stands, occupied now by the Torvaldsens' great-great-granddaughter, who uses the underground rooms for wine storage and maintains them as a historical feature. The original cabin, the one Katrine built in 1881, was preserved as a territorial landmark in 1925. Visitors can still climb down into the underground room and feel warmth radiating from Earth that hasn't needed active heating in over a century. The thermal mass continues to moderate temperature even now, demonstrating the longevity of passive Earth-coupled systems. Katrine herself lived to be 87 years old, dying in 1936. Her obituary in the Red Lodge newspaper described her as a pioneer who brought Old World wisdom to New World challenges, and noted that her heating system had saved more lives than most doctors. At her funeral, attended by over 200 people, Henrik spoke about their first meeting, how he'd ridden through killing cold to check on a woman he'd expected to find frozen, and instead found her warm and alive, teaching him that survival wasn't about strength, but about knowledge. There's a broader lesson here about how we think about survival and innovation. We tend to imagine frontier life as a story of rugged individuals conquering nature through force of will, burning resources and enduring hardship. But the people who actually thrived on the frontier were the ones who worked with nature, who understood systems and cycles, who brought knowledge from diverse cultures and adapted it to new conditions. Katrine didn't conquer Montana's winter. She made peace with it. She didn't fight the cold with brute force. She worked with the Earth's natural properties to create a sustainable solution. Her innovation wasn't really innovation at all. It was the application of ancient knowledge to a new place. Think about what that means for challenges we face today. How much wisdom have we forgotten in our rush toward new solutions? How many problems could be solved by looking backward as well as forward, by asking what people knew before we stopped paying attention? The Earth still holds heat the same way it did in 1882. Stone still stores thermal energy. Passive systems still work. The physics haven't changed. What's changed is our awareness, our willingness to learn from methods that don't involve consuming resources or applying technology. Katrine Muller's warm room survives not because it was built with exceptional materials or rare skills, but because it was built with understanding. She knew what the Earth could do, and she gave it time to do it. She planned ahead, worked steadily, and trusted in principles that had sustained humans for thousands of years. When neighbors found her warm at 40 below, they weren't discovering magic. They were rediscovering wisdom. If this story resonated with you, if you value the preservation of traditional knowledge and frontier survival techniques, please hit that subscribe button. These stories matter. These techniques matter. The wisdom of people like Katrine Muller matters, and the only way we keep it alive is by sharing it, studying it, and passing it forward to others who understand that survival is about knowledge, not just courage. The frozen prairie where Katrine nearly died that winter is farmland now, irrigated and productive. But underneath it, if you dig down 6 feet, the Earth is still warm. It remembers. It holds its heat through seasons and decades. waiting patiently to share what it knows with anyone willing to learn. That's the real legacy of the warm room. Not just a clever technique for frontier heating, but a reminder that the Earth itself is a teacher, if we're humble enough to be students.